gamers, welcome to Video Games and the World. My name is John, your host, and today is the first episode of Video Games and the World, The Birth of Video Games. It is a three-part episode that will consist on the birth of video games, from the beginnings up until Unreal Engine and how it is today, and how games influence a lot of people. To some, they made a positive influence in their lives, but others would say the opposite. So, enjoy the episode of Video Games and the World. I am John, your host. What is a video game? A video game is an electronic game that involves user interaction to generate visual feedback on a video device such as a TV screen or a computer monitor. Video games are sometimes believed to be a form of art, while others have condemned it. In the beginning, there was a world without video games. Before video games, people found other forms of entertainment such as children playing hide and seek, tic-tac-toe on pencil and paper, tag, chess, and other board games like Monopoly. And people even went to the matinee, as movie theaters were called back in those days. However, the creation of video games began almost in the middle of the 20th century, when innovative minds at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology began to create video games. Before all of that, though, in the 1940s, the earliest example was a cathode ray tube amusement device, which was filed for a patent on January 25 of that same year by Thomas T. Goldsmith Jr. and Estelle Ray Mann, and issued on December 14, 1948, as U.S. Patent 24555992. At first, they had machines where you got to play chess, checkers, and even more inspirations began to unravel, such as football games at MIT during the 1960s. Example of earliest games were the Nimrod computer in 1951 at the Festival at Britain, OXO, a tic-tac-toe type of video game created by Alexander S. Douglas for the EdTech in 1952, Tennis for Two, an electronic interactive game engineered by William Higginbotham in 1958, Space War, written by MIT students Martin Grates, Steve Russell, and Wade Itanens on a DEC PDP-1 computer in 1961. And finally, there's Pong, a 1972 game by Atari. Video games became even more relevant during the late 1960s to the early 1970s, when Ralph Baer, known as the father of video games, created something called the Brown Box, a prototype video game that let players play games such as tennis and other games. In 1968, he patented his interactive television game, and 4 years later, in 1972, Magnavox releases Odyssey, the first home console based on his designs. On that same year, Nolan Bushnell and Al Alcorn of Atari developed an arcade table tennis game. When they start testing it in Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnydale, California, it starts working. Why? Because so many people played it with so very much it jammed with quarters. And so, that popular tennis arcade game was known as Pong, the very first arcade game of its kind before arcade games such as Space Invaders, Galaga, and many more existed. With Pong, the video game industry evolved from a subculture of computer labs and universities and into the domain of pop culture. 3 years later, in 1975, Atari introduces a home version of Pong. Atari's founder, Nolan Bushnell, could not find any partners in the toys business, so he sells the first units through the Sears Roebuck Sporting Goods department. A year after Pong's arcade's release, the first general computer magazine, Creative Computing, David Ahl, publishes 101 basic computer games, allowing gamers to become an ancient Sumerian king in H.M. Rabi, find the creatures in hiding in a grid in Mug WMP, and command the North versus South in Civil W, which could have been Civil War. In 1974, decades before Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, Duke Nukem, GoldenEye, Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, Battlefield, and many more ever existed, Maze Wars was introduced. This is considered the very first FPS game of its kind by taking players into a labyrinth of passages made for wireframe graphics. 2 years later, before RPGs like Final Fantasy, Elder Scrolls, Chrono Trigger, and many more existed, a game inspired by Dungeons & Dragons was created, and that game was called Adventure, created originally by William Crowther in 1975. Adventure was a text-based pioneering game by Don Woods. The game plunged players into an imaginary world with caves and treasures. The game paved the way for Zork, as well as other RPG games such as Wizardry and 1,000 others. In 1977, the year of Star Wars, Atari releases a video computer system more commonly known as the Atari 2600, featuring a joystick, interchangeable cartridges, games in color, and switches for selecting games and selecting difficulty levels, thus making millions of Americans home video game players. Aside from gaming, I must say that the 70s was one hell of a decade, because we had various great movies such as American Graffiti, The Godfather 1 and 2, Superman, Star Wars, Saturday Night Fever, and so on. The Godfather and Star Wars would have video games as well. Superman would have his own video game in the Atari and later in the NES. In 1978, Taito released in Japan one of the biggest arcade hits of all time, Space Invaders. The game became very popular in the USA upon its release, which was jammed with quarters each time players hung out with playing that game in arcades, bowling alleys, pizzerias, and many more. Then, in the final year of the decade, toymaker Mattel supplements its handheld electronic games with a new console, the Intellivision. This console had better graphics and more sophisticated controls than the 2600, and players loved its sports games. Mattel sold 3 million units. The 1970s was known as the first generation of video games. As for Space Invaders, this game introduced or popularized several important concepts in arcade video games, including play regulated by lives instead of a timer or set score, gaining extra lives through accumulating points, and the tracking of the high score achieved on the machine. It was also the first game to confront the player with waves of targets that would shoot back at the player, and the first to include background music during the gameplay, a simple 4-note loop. With its intense gameplay and competitive scoring feature Space Invaders a national phenomenon, as over 200,000 Invader games counting clones and knockoffs entered the Japanese game centers by the middle of 1979. While not as quite as popular in the United States, Space Invaders became the biggest hit the industry has seen since the Great Depression as Midway. Serving as a North American manufacturer, moved over 60,000 cabinets. The 1-2 punch of Space Invaders and the Atari game Asteroids, which moved 70,000 units and popularized the recording of multiple high scores in a table, resulted in video arcade games completely displacing pinball and other amusements to become the central attraction of not just a shopping mall arcade, but also a variety of street locations from convenience stores to bowling alleys to pizza parlors and many more. Many of the best-selling games of 1980 and 81, such as Galaxian, Defender, Missile Command, Tempest, and Galaga, focus on shooting mechanics and achieving high scores. The 80s. It was a very special time to many people, with all these awesome movies, sitcoms, outgoings, and a lot of other things too. However, the early 80s would birth the second generation, and then the video game industry would suffer a downfall in an event known as the video game crash of 1983. Video games would evolve to a whole new level as there would be competitions and tournaments during the summer and some other seasons as well. In 1980, a missing slice of pizza inspired Namco's Toru Iwatani to create a game called Pac-Man, which went on sale on July of that same year. The game was released on Atari 2600, and Pac-Man was such a great game that men and women enjoyed. Pac-Man has his own movie in the movie Pixels. In 1999, gamer Billy Mitchell became the first person to achieve a perfect score of Pac-Man. The character that gives its name to the game is a small yellow pie-like figure with a missing wedge for its mouth. Players direct Pac-Man through a series of mazes while avoiding 4 ghosts, Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde. In order to continue on to the next level, the player must clear the maze of its 240 dots and 4 Energizer pills. If Pac-Man is caught by one of the ghosts, he disappears into a yellow life and a life is lost. Eating an Energizer pill gives Pac-Man a temporary ability to eat the ghost for 1,600 bonus points each. Fruits and other random objects appear throughout the mazes to be eaten for extra points. With Pac-Man, the focus of the video game industry shifted from space shooting games to maze chase games. Arcades flourished, and arcade games appeared in an array of businesses. Pac-Man acted as a mascot of the video game revolution. His success introduced a new type of lovable video game characters: Mario, Sonic, and Pikachu, and many more. Like Pong, clones of Pac-Man were plentiful, but none were as popular as the original. 2 years later, a spin-off known as Ms. Pac-Man was created, striking a blow for gender equality by becoming the best-selling arcade game of all time. According to trade publication Vending Times, revenues generated by coin-operated video games on location in the United States jumped from $308 million in 1978 to $968 million in 1979 to $2.8 billion in 1980. As Pac-Man ignited an even larger video game craze and attracted more female players to arcades, revenues jumped again to $4.9 billion in 1981. According to trade publication Playmeter, by July 1982, total coin-op collections peaked at $8.9 billion, of which $7.7 billion came from video games. Meanwhile, the number of arcades defined as any location with 10 or more games more than doubled between July 1981 and July 1983, from over 10,000 to just over 25,000. These figures made arcade games the most popular entertainment medium in the country, far surpassing both pop music and Hollywood films. Pop music at 4 billion sales per year, and Hollywood films 3 billion. In the following year after Pac-Man's success, Nintendo introduced its most popular mascot that still reigns as such up until this day. And that mascot is none other than Mario. Many video game fans went crazy over Donkey Kong featuring a character called Jumpman, Mario's original name at the time. Shigeru Miyamoto-san would later make him the star of Nintendo by making a game series which will have various adventures in the Mushroom Kingdom, fighting against Bowser and his minions alongside his brother Luigi and saving Princess Peach. Mario would not only have adventure games but also sports games such as kart racing, tennis, baseball, soccer, golf, and so on. 2 years later, the video game industry went on a severe recession in both Japan and North America that occurred from '83 to '85. This event was known as the Game Crash of '83. Video games had started to boom in the 70s and 80s, when a group of intelligent young minds came together in MIT in the 1950s and 60s to create a new form of entertainment, and this is how it all began. On the next episode of Video Games in the World, we shall be speaking about the crash of '83 up until when video games went from sprites to glorious 3D. Be sure to comment, rate, and subscribe, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for watching, everyone. This is your host, John. Game on, and have a good one, gamers. Bye-bye.